The year is 1095. Europe is starving. Generations of endless war, failed harvests, and brutal feudal lords have left the common people with nothing, no land, no wealth, no hope. Then, a message arrives from the east. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople is begging for help. His ancient empire is crumbling under the relentless attacks of a new, terrifying enemy, the Seljuk Turks. He writes to the one man in Europe who holds more power than any king, Pope Urban II. The Pope sees an opportunity not just to save Constantinople, but to unite a violent, fractured Europe under one banner. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont, he delivers a speech that will set the world on fire. He tells the knights, the peasants, the sinners, that there is a way to wash away their crimes, a holy war, a march across the known world to reclaim the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. He promised them heaven. What they found was hell. This is the true story of the First Crusade. When the Pope called for war, he expected kings and professional armies to answer. He expected trained knights. He did not expect the peasants. Before the noble armies could even gather their supplies, a radical preacher emerged. His name was Peter the Hermit. He rode on a donkey. He wore dirty rags. But when he spoke, thousands listened. He promised the starving masses of Europe that God would protect them, that they didn't need armor, that they didn't need money. Faith would be their shield. Driven by desperation and religious fervor, an army of commoners, farmers, women, and children began the massive journey east. History remembers them as the People's Crusade. But faith does not fill an empty stomach. As this massive, untrained mob crossed into Eastern Europe, they ran out of food. They began to pillage Christian cities along the way. They rioted. They looted. By the time they reached Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, was horrified. He had asked the Pope for elite mercenaries. Instead, he received a starving, uncontrollable mob, wanting them out of his city. The emperor quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into enemy territory in Asia Minor. It was a death sentence. In October 1096, the Seljuk Turkish army ambushed them. The peasants had no tactics, no armor, no discipline. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The People's Crusade was annihilated. The bones of the peasants were left to bleach in the sun. The Turks believed the European threat was over. They were wrong. The real army was just arriving. By the spring of 1097, the true power of Europe reached the gates of Constantinople. This was not a mob. This was the Prince's Crusade. 4 massive, professional armies, led by the most ruthless and experienced warlords of Western Europe. Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse. Over 60,000 men, heavily armored knights, veteran infantry, deadly archers. But before they could cross into Asia, Emperor Alexios demanded something in return, an oath. He forced the European lords to swear allegiance to him. Any lands they conquered from the Turks must be returned to the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders agreed, but in their hearts, they had no intention of handing over their conquests. They had not marched 2,000 miles to fight for a Greek emperor. They were fighting for themselves. The fragile alliance crossed into Asia Minor. Their first target was the heavily fortified city of Nicaea. The Crusaders laid siege. But just as the city was about to fall, the Byzantines secretly negotiated a surrender with the defenders. When the Crusaders woke up, They saw Byzantine flags flying over the walls. They were denied the chance to loot the city. The betrayal stung. The trust between the Europeans and the Byzantines was broken forever. But there was no time for anger. The road to Jerusalem was long, and the brutal heat of the Anatolian summer had just begun. In July 1097, the Crusader army marched deeper into the unforgiving landscape of Anatolia. Due to the massive size of their force, they split into two separate columns to find enough water. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, saw his moment. He had destroyed the peasants a year earlier. Now, he intended to destroy the knights. Near the valley of Dorylaeum, the First Crusader column, led by Bohemond, was suddenly surrounded. Thousands of Turkish horse archers poured down from the hills. The Turkish tactics were terrifying. They did not fight in close combat. They rode in circles, firing clouds of deadly arrows, and retreating before the heavy knights could strike back. The Crusaders were pinned down. Men and horses fell under the relentless rain of arrows. The heat was suffocating. Panic began to spread. Bohemond ordered his men to hold the line, to lock their shields, to survive. For hours, the heavy infantry stood their ground, absorbing the devastating fire. They were dying. The line was about to break. And then, a horn blew in the distance. The Second Crusader column, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, had arrived. They crashed into the Turkish flanks with the unstoppable force of heavy cavalry. The Seljuks, caught completely by surprise, panicked and fled. The Crusaders had won. It was a turning point. The victory proved that European heavy armor and discipline could survive the deadly speed of the Eastern archers. But the victory cost them dearly. For the next 3 months, they marched across the scorched earth of Anatolia. There was no food. There was no water. Horses died by the thousands. Knights were forced to walk on foot, wearing heavy chainmail in the blistering heat. By the time they reached the borders of Syria, they were exhausted. But their greatest test was waiting for them. October 1097. The Crusaders arrived at the ancient city of Antioch. It was a monster of a city, surrounded by massive walls, flanked by steep mountains, and heavily defended. Taking it by storm was impossible. The Crusaders settled in for a siege, but winter was coming, and the supply lines were completely cut. What followed was a nightmare. Famine struck the Crusader camp. Men ate their dying horses. They ate dogs. They ate roots and leather. Disease spread through the tents. Thousands deserted. Even Peter the Hermit, the man who had preached this holy war, tried to flee in the night before he was caught and brought back in shame. For 8 grueling months, the siege dragged on. Then, in June 1098, word arrived that a massive Muslim relief army, led by Kerboga of Mosul, was marching to crush them. If the Crusaders did not take Antioch before Kerboga arrived, they would be annihilated. Bohemond, the most cunning of the Crusader commanders, made a secret deal. He found a traitor inside the city, an Armenian guard named Firuz. In the dead of night, Firuz lowered a rope from a tower. A small group of knights climbed the wall, killed the guards, and opened the gates. The Crusaders poured into Antioch. Driven mad by 8 months of starvation and suffering, they showed no mercy. The city fell in a storm of violence, but the victory was a trap. Days later, Kerboga's massive relief army arrived. The Crusaders were now trapped inside the city they had just conquered. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and starving. Despair consumed them. Many believed it was the end, until a miracle happened. A poor monk named Peter Bartholomew came forward with a vision. He claimed that Saint Andrew had appeared to him in a dream. The saint told him that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Jesus Christ on the cross, was buried beneath a church in Antioch. The commanders were skeptical, but the desperate soldiers needed hope. They dug frantically beneath the church. For hours, they found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Peter himself jumped into the pit. Moments later, he emerged, holding a piece of rusted iron. It was the lance. Whether it was a genuine relic or a brilliant psychological trick, it didn't matter. The effect on the starving army was electric. They believed God was physically with them. On June 28, 1098, the starving, ragged Crusaders marched out of the gates of Antioch to face Kaboga's massive army. They did not march like desperate men. They marched in absolute silence, in perfect formation, carrying the Holy Lance at the front of their lines. The sight of these starving fanatics, marching fearlessly towards certain death, terrified the divided Muslim army. When the heavy Crusader cavalry charged, Kaboga's alliance shattered, his commanders abandoned him, his army collapsed and fled. Against all mathematical logic, the Crusaders had won. Antioch was theirs. The road to Jerusalem was finally open. How did a starving, exhausted army from Europe survive so deep in hostile territory? The answer lies in the politics of the Middle East. When the Crusaders arrived, the Islamic world was deeply fractured. There was no unified empire. The Sunni Seljuk Turks in the north despised the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt more than they despised the Christian invaders. Instead of uniting against the common threat, the Muslim lords fought among themselves. The Fatimids in Egypt even sent envoys to the Crusaders, offering an alliance against the Turks. They thought the Crusaders were just Byzantine mercenaries. They did not understand that these men were not fighting for land. They were fighting for God. By the time the Muslim leaders realized the true threat, it was too late. In June 1099, 3 long years after leaving Europe, the surviving Crusaders finally reached their destination. Of the 60,000 soldiers who had left Europe, only 15,000 remained. They were battered, traumatized, and hardened by years of brutal warfare. When they saw the walls of Jerusalem in the distance, many fell to their knees and wept. But the Fatimid defenders of the city were ready. They had poisoned the wells outside the walls. They had cleared the land of trees, so the Crusaders could not build siege engines. Once again, the blistering summer heat became the greatest enemy. Without water, the Crusaders knew they would die of thirst before they could breach the walls. They needed a miracle, and they found it. 2 Genoese supply ships arrived at a nearby port. The Crusaders dismantled the ships, carrying the heavy timber miles across the desert. With this wood, they built 2 massive siege towers. On July 13th, 1099, the final assault began. For 2 days, the fighting was horrific. Arrows, Greek fire, and boiling oil rained down on the attackers. But the Crusaders pushed the great siege towers closer to the walls. On July 15th, the tower commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon reached the northern wall. A wooden bridge was dropped. 2 Flemish knights, Lieteld and Engelbert, were the first to cross. The defenses were breached. The Crusader army poured into Jerusalem. 3 years of starvation, 3 years of death, 3 years of religious fanaticism exploded in the narrow streets of the Holy City. The capture of Jerusalem was absolute. The Muslim and Jewish defenders were overwhelmed. The fighting was ruthless, marking one of the darkest and most unforgiving chapters of medieval warfare. By nightfall, the city was quiet. The First Crusade had succeeded. Against all odds, against geography, against famine, against vastly superior numbers. The Europeans had conquered the Holy Land. But conquering a city is not the same as holding it. Most of the surviving Crusaders, having fulfilled their vows, returned home to Europe as legends. But a few stayed behind. They established 4 fragile, isolated kingdoms in the Middle East: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to wear a crown of gold in the city where Jesus had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. These new Crusader states were surrounded by enemies. They were vastly outnumbered. To survive, they would have to build massive castles and create elite military orders, the Knights Hospitaller and the legendary Knights Templar. The First Crusade was an unprecedented shock to the medieval world. It proved the terrifying power of religious zealotry, combined with heavy military discipline. But the Islamic world would not stay divided forever. The Crusaders had awakened a sleeping giant. In the decades to come, new leaders would rise in the East, men who would unite the fractured Muslim world. Men like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and a brilliant Kurdish general whose name would echo through eternity, Saladin. The Holy War was not over. It had only just begun. If you want to hear the story of Saladin and the devastating Muslim counterattack, let us know in the comments. Make sure you are subscribed to Epic Chronicles and turn on notifications, because history is written by the victors. But the truth is always more complicated. See you in the next video.